While I love a good tactical shooter and the occasional puzzle game, I never really thought about what would happen if you decided to mix those two genres together while making it so you have a single bullet which needs to be guided across a map. But that's exactly what you'll be doing in Children of the Sun from developer Renee Rother and publisher Devolver Digital. But is Children of the Sun the magic bullet we've been waiting for, or does it miss its shot entirely? Let's find out in our full review. But hey, don't you get sniped by the echo chambers of gaming. Head on over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames where you can gain Discord access to the greatest indie gaming community, early ad-free shows, shoutouts at the end of every video we produce, an exclusive podcast, and even free games depending on the tier you select. Your new indie gaming community is waiting for you. As I discussed during my intro, Children of the Sun is indeed a self-proclaimed tactical puzzle shooter. You play as the girl, tasked with taking down an evil cult with beady yellow eyes, led by the leader. End the leader's life, and you win the game, yay! There's really not much here in the way of dialogue, with the story being told through very stylistic, psychotic flashing cutscenes that do a great job of bringing this world to life. And while yes, I could have done with some more character development, the developer's main point is well presented, if not a bit heavy-handed depending on how the audience interprets things. Children of the Sun is broken up into 26 different levels, all of which include leaderboards, but I'll get into the scoring system a little bit later. After selecting a level, players will be shown a brief cutscene that will help to lay out the land in front of them a bit, and then you'll find yourself in complete control of the girl. Moving the girl, however, is rather interesting, with her being fastened tightly to a 2D plane that rotates around you. The movement almost reminded me a bit of the Suda51 classic Killer 7, without the different hallways and paths to select. In fact, stylistically, it's hard not to feel the legendary Suda's influence in much of Children of the Sun, but if you've played classic games like, say, Pandemonium back on the PS1, you'll also have an idea for how this one moves and flows. Sort of that whole 2.5D thing. The ability to move at all basically boils down to where you want to take your first shot from. Both mouse and controller are an option, however, I personally recommend the mouse for Children of the Sun. There is a level of precision involved with being successful during this campaign, precision that felt restricted on a joystick. As you move about and aim down your sights, you can identify cult members by placing a little marker above their heads. This also helps you to chart a path of success for your bullets. Once you have at least the cult members that you can see labeled, some of them do like to hide, it's time to choose your first target and let that bullet fly. Once the sniper bullet lets loose and strikes its first victim, it's up to you to move the bullet to the next foe, though you'll be limited in where you can move it and how you can move it. This is where the puzzle element of Children of the Sun truly starts to shine through. The placement of the first initial bullet is critical, as it needs to strike a victim or one of the game's many destructible objects to stay in play. Fail to hit a target, and your run is gonna be over. No checkpoints here at all, you'll need to complete each run with that single bullet hitting every designated target. Once everyone's dead, you win the level! I'm sounding way too happy and optimistic for a pretty dark and disturbing game. This means that runs can last as quickly as 50 seconds, or even shorter depending on your skill level, to up to an hour as you learn each level. It's important to learn the land, where to shoot from, and which strategy is going to work the best. Do I shoot a gas tank to blow up a car which might take out a few cult members at once, or do I ping pong off of birds in the sky to get a better angle? There is room for some degree of experimentation, but I also felt like the developer drew out a pretty clear path that they want you to follow, and it's just a matter of learning that path. Making things even more complex are some of the abilities unlocked as players progress. Eventually, I learned the ability to reverse the direction of the bullet itself, which can be activated by hitting a certain crucial point of an enemy. I also learned how to perform a charged up shot, which needs to gather speed. This is necessary for taking out cult members that are draped in heavy armor. All told, the gameplay is pretty fun at times, and addicting even, though admittedly my frustration did boil over on more than one occasion. Coming painfully close to hitting my last shot, the one which would complete whatever level I was on, only to miss my final cult member by a centimeter or two, was pretty infuriating. Hit detection did not always feel 100% to me, as it felt like the occasional bullet just whizzed right through enemies without detecting the target as being hit. Regardless, I can't stress enough the amount of precision necessary to be successful at Children of the Sun, and that's where the mouse controls really become crucial. Upon completion of a level, expect to be scored. Scores are tallied based on the amount of distance your bullet travels, how many headshots occurred, how many of the targets you struck were moving, and how many side objectives on the map were completed. Yes, there are some side missions to take on to add a little bit of replay value alongside the leaderboard competition. While I never felt pressured by any in-game timer outside of one level that uses one, the quicker that you can complete a level, the less points will be lost on the end score. How many shots you fire also results in negative points, all of this factoring into a final score that places you against the rest of the world. So if it wasn't already obvious, there just aren't many products on the market like Children of the Sun, so it does deserve some points for originality, without question, and I did enjoy solving each puzzle despite my frustrations, most of which were my own doing to be fair to the game. I spent 7 hours getting through the campaign, which may or may not take you longer depending on your skill level, and maybe you'll need a bit of luck too. Outside of the sniping though, Children of the Sun does occasionally attempt to switch up the gameplay, but not that often. At one point, I was guiding the girl's head through a Pac-Man style maze, and in another later level, I was swerving in a car to avoid flaming Molotov cocktails being hurled in my direction. It is a nice change of pace, honestly, though I wish the game leaned into even more of this wackiness, as the minigames were few and far between. In the end, if you're simply a shooter fan and aren't too keen on puzzles, I don't think Children of the Sun is going to be for you. This is not a fast-paced action romp. It is indeed tactical in nature and a bit of a thinking man's game. There is no running in with a machine gun mowing down cult members here, though saying that out loud just now did sound kind of cool, but stylistically, I think we'll all mostly agree that Children of the Sun looks amazing. I keep going back to Suda51 in some of his older games, but the artistic direction chosen for this title does feel like a mix of his zaniness with the grimy, gritty look of a horror movie taking place somewhere out in the woods. The lighting is just phenomenal, cult members are beyond creepy looking, and environments are richly detailed. It was lovely to see some of the finer details depending on where your bullet would end up. Sound design is also exquisite, and even dynamic. My favorite touch was the synthy pitter-patter sound that would follow the girl's footsteps. It's a chilling soundscape that can be greatly appreciated with a nice pair of headphones or a bassy sound system. All told, it's hard not to praise both the visuals and the audio of Children of the Sun. Despite all of its positives, Children of the Sun also did feel like a game that I completed once and I wasn't personally drawn to returning to. I'm not the most competitive person out there, so leaderboards weren't all that enticing for me, and outside of maybe going back to try and grab some of the few challenges that I missed, I just don't see myself coming back to it. It's a neat one-time experience, again in my opinion, but I don't really feel like it's a game that I want to play over and over again. But also, that's perfectly fine. It was a 7-hour experience that I enjoyed. As far as performance was concerned, Children of the Sun ran beautifully on both my now aging 2070 Super and my 4070 PC rigs, and it even booted up on my Steam Deck without any issues. While the frame rates weren't as crisp on the handheld and it takes a bit of a graphical hit, the game still manages to run at frame rates of 40 plus most of the time, even hitting 60 FPS depending on the level you're playing. Again, unless you plan to hook up a mouse to your Steam Deck, you'll lose a good deal of precision having to use joysticks, but either way, handheld players that are interested should have little fear about how the game runs. Children of the Sun is a very unique, interesting product, one of the stranger ones I've reviewed here on the channel. I had a good time going through its levels and figuring out the best path forward on a single bullet. It's a really neat concept that's pretty well executed on, and I could see it being even further fleshed out as the developer continues to make games, hopefully. Some of the levels were extremely frustrating, but all of them could be learned after enough time. The heavy-handed nature of the story could also rub some audiences the wrong way, though thematically I thought it was quite gritty and well presented despite a lack of character development. And the visual and audio design, really dang impressive here. This is the definition of a niche product that simply won't be for everyone, and hey, not every game needs to be. I'd say if it sounds like something you might enjoy, if you really like oddball games like classic Suda51 titles, you'll get something out of this one. Give it a look. But if you're hoping for an action-fueled romp and don't like puzzle games, Children of the Sun won't be the game for you. In the end, I found the gameplay loop pretty fun and addicting. Yes, there were frustrations for sure, but I also really enjoyed the visuals and the audio design, and ultimately thought it was a fun way to spend those 7 hours. I'm awarding Children of the Sun the Bronze Genie lamp of approval.